Hilfskreuzer or auxiliary cruisers were disguised commerce raiders of the German Navy. During World War II, the capital ships of the German Navy were primarily deployed as commerce raiders. Their sorties led to the mobilization of significant Allied naval and air resources, caused disruption to vital convoy supply routes, providing opportunities for Germany's own blockade runners, and played an important role in maintaining the morale of the German people. But intriguingly, they implanted in the minds of warship enthusiasts everywhere the image of aesthetically beautiful, somehow doomed vessels, sailing alone or in pairs, eluding more powerful forces, sometimes fighting, sometimes not, sometimes even being scuttling by their own crews, in the face of far superior odds, and in some extraordinary way, their short operational lives have cast a spell over the generations that have followed, as countless people worldwide, from all sides, remain fascinated by them to this day. Yet, despite their elegance, speed and power, these large ships failed. Considering their enormous cost, awesome power, mighty armament and colossal crews, the few ships they sank or captured were a very poor return. But these weren't the only German surface raiders of World War II. There were 9 other, little-known warships, which, between them, accounted for 142 ships sunk or captured, grossing more than 870,000 tons, in a total of 3,769 days at sea, an average of more than 230 tons of enemy ships sunk or captured per day. If this operational record is impressive, then in economic terms, the figures are even more so, as this outstanding performance was achieved by little more than 3,000 officers and men, in 9 second-hand freighters, armed with third-hand weapons, the total cost of which, both in terms of purchase price and the cost of fitting out, represented barely 1% of the cost of the battleship Bismarck. They were the Hilfskreuzer, the auxiliary cruisers, commerce raiders, which although built as freighters, went to sea and fought as true warships. So why do they remain so relatively unknown, their exploits so obscure, their names virtually forgotten? Because they were not glamorous. They were, in fact, deliberately, very unglamorous. They were nondescript German freighters, disguised as nondescript, non-German freighters. There is nothing beautiful to be seen in the few existing photographs of these ships. Their silhouettes have nothing in common with the delicate yet aggressive, beautifully proportioned fighting lines of the Tirpitz. Their characteristics were precisely right for what was required of them, that in being unglamorous, nondescript, and dirty, they would not attract attention, and could therefore go about their deadly and stealthy business, undisturbed. The auxiliary cruisers were often at sea for more than a year. Their concept was not entirely supported by the high command of the Kriegsmarine. Only months before the outbreak of the war, high-ranking staff officers expressed their lack of confidence in the strategy. There would be better communication systems, long-range reconnaissance aircraft, and no safe haven German colonies, like during World War I. So the entire Hilfskreuzer fleet would have to rely on non-tested, non-guaranteed supply systems, and, critically, reaching the open sea from Germany under the ever-vigilant eyes of the UK and France was considered next to impossible. Behind all this lies the fact that at this time, the strategic thinking of the Kriegsmarine on surface warfare of any kind was anything but audacious. The high-ranking old-style officers were notoriously overcautious. However, the Nazi principle of blind obedience to the leader, who was never wrong, that single-minded way of thinking so typical of all dictatorial systems, deeply contaminated the Navy. The final compromise reached by the professionals, the old-style thinkers and the Nazi-influenced younger officers was as follows. Auxiliary cruisers? By all means, but not as a top priority. Only 5 ships, not 50, maybe some more later on depending on results. Only general service freighters, and not particularly the best ones, obsolete 5-9-inch secondary batteries from the 40-year-old pre-dreadnought battleships, volunteer crews, not required by other ships, officers taken mostly from the reserve force, commanders not considered to be the most brilliant, in other words, those not qualified to serve on the magnificent, very expensive, regular units, and, above all, absolute secrecy. In other words, The more or less unavoidable loss of the 5 ships must not be allowed to affect the German people's morale or their faith in final victory. Apart from this general principle, the tactic was simple: to stay at sea as long as possible, to disturb the sea lanes as much as they could, to avoid any fight with enemy units of equal strength. Some of the auxiliary cruisers were loaded with magnetic mines so that they could act as mine layers in the vicinity of ports that under normal conditions would not have been considered to be at war, such as those in South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. At the beginning of the campaign, between April and June 1940, when the first wave of auxiliary cruisers, Orion, Atlantis, Witter, Thor, and Penguin, departed from German ports, the very few German officers who were even aware of their existence would not have bet any money on the possibility of their staying afloat for more than a week. 3 of them, Atlantis, Penguin, and Thor, were modern diesel freighters with very long range, around 50,000 miles at the economical speed that gave maximum distance with minimum fuel consumption, and 2 of them, Orion and Witter, were large enough to carry magnetic mines. These latter 2 had between them the second-hand boiler turbine engines, very thirsty and unreliable. None of them had any bulkheads, and all remained unmodified from the point of view of buoyancy. The basic fitting out they received was concentrated on armament, and on the capacity to disguise the ship. The crews were large by normal freighter standards, but small for a raider cruiser, and thus, one of the main problems faced by their commanders was how to maintain the morale of 300-plus young conscript sailors during months, or sometimes years, of continuous war at sea, not to mention the maintenance of discipline among the often very numerous prisoners taken on board. By the second half of 1940, because of the amazing successes of the 5 ships, Hitler himself had joined the pro-auxiliary cruisers lobby, demonstrating one of the few positive aspects of a dictatorship, in that when the dictator is in favor of something, everything is suddenly in its favor. Most of the earlier restrictions were lifted, and a second wave, comprising 6 ships, was quickly fitted out. The first of these, the Comet, reached the Pacific Rim on the coast of Siberia in an outstanding feat of seamanship, earning the first Rear Admiral's flag of the Raider fleet for her commander, Robert Eisen, while 3 more, Steer, Michel and Cormoran, also succeeded in reaching the open sea. The last 2 however, Coronel, the former freighter Togo, and Hansa, the former Danish freighter Glengarry, one of the best fitted out for the task, were unable to get past the increasingly vigilant British. All 9 HKs carried the same main armament, 6 40-year-old 150mm guns on single mountings, well camouflaged behind false partitions or dummy cargo on the upper hull, 2 underwater torpedo tubes, 4 to 6 37mm dual-purpose guns and a 75mm gun, sometimes disguised as a 105mm gun like the ones mounted on the stern of most British and American freighters from early 1942. All of them carried either 1 or 2 Arado AR-196 seaplanes, with 1 often unassembled in reserve, and several automatic guns. The Hilfskreuzer, in short, were ill-equipped to face light or heavy cruisers, and only just capable of fighting armed merchant cruisers. While they were not designed to engage in battle, some raiders were forced to face light cruisers and even heavy cruisers, and unbelievable as it might seem, the commander of one of them, Otto Kahler in HK Thor, actively sought to do battle with the light cruisers. By late 1940, war conditions for the Hilfskreuzer had become even more difficult as British Admiralty orders now demanded avoidance of all ships at sea, and the immediate use of radio, regardless of risk. These were tough measures, but necessary in order to locate the raiders. As a consequence, prize-capturing techniques had to change. The raiders' seaplanes became infinitely more important, and not just for reconnaissance purposes. When a prize was identified, the aircraft would fly over her mastheads, grabbing her radio antennas with a trailing grappling hook, and, if necessary, strafing her decks with machine gun fire. In some cases the pilot would set down close to the ship, and keep station in front of her, engine running and machine guns trained, a thoroughly convincing display in the case of fully loaded tankers, and await the arrival of the raider. Even that tactic was to become obsolete during 1941. Ships escaping at full speed, while sending radio distress signals, called for the German procedures to change again. Some raider commanders decided to stop attacking by daylight. Having identified a potential target, they would strive to remain undetected. They would then analyze the bearing and speed of the victim in order to calculate the best bearing and speed that would allow them to get into a favorable attack position after nightfall. The best time was just before moonrise while approaching from the dark horizon. This tactic was to prove very efficient, as the victims, taken completely by surprise, rarely used their radios and invariably surrendered quickly. It was more costly in terms of lives lost, but the toughening war conditions made it almost unavoidable. German auxiliary cruiser Michel was the last operative German raider of World War II. Almost within sight of Japan and only 50 miles out from port, Michel was spotted by the U.S. submarine Tarpon on October 20, 1943. In one of the few instances of American submarines attacking a German ship during World War II, Tarpon fired a total of 8 torpedoes in 4 successive strikes, of which 4 torpedoes struck home and detonated. Michel sank, taking down 290 of her crew, including the captain. The 116 survivors reached safety in Japan after a 3-day journey in open boats. Scores of others had been left on rafts and floating wreckage, but the Imperial Japanese Navy search aircraft reported they had seen nothing. This caused some friction with the German Navy officers in Japan, who felt the Japanese seemed unconcerned about rescuing possible German survivors. The loss of the Michel marked the end of the cruises of German auxiliary commerce raiders. To award the actions of the ships, Admiral Raeder introduced the Kriegsabzeichen für Hilfskreuzer or the Auxiliary Cruiser Badge in April of 1941. The decoration could be awarded to all crews, even posthumously. The award featured a Viking longship sailing over the northern hemisphere of the globe surrounded by a laurel wreath of oak leaves. At the apex of the badge was a German eagle clutching a swastika. The wreath, eagle, and ship were in gilt and the globe area gray-colored. Versions were produced in bronze and later in zinc. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss my future work, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel and press the bell notification button. Thank you and see you in the next video.